Good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to be here again with all of you.
Amen.
What if I told you about a man who fasted for 4 months so that he could bring about unity? He's very concerned about unity, and so he fasted for 4 months. That would probably sound more dramatic than it actually is. And there is a man in the Bible who fasted for 4 months so that he could fulfill a project and bring about unity, but he didn't fast literally for 4 months. He fasted, periodically for 4 months. And so I'd like to look at that man tonight in Nehemiah chapter 1 through 3. If you'll open to Nehemiah chapter 1 through 3. In Nehemiah chapter 1 through 3, you have a man who has a project. He sees a challenge. He sees a sort of an idea that needs to be taken care of. He sees a problem, and he wants to do something about that problem. And that's a gift that some people have. Some people can see things that need to be fixed. Some people can look around and they can see problems that need to be solved, and other people seem to be completely oblivious of them. And have you ever walked in a store and you look around and you think, I know why the store is failing, right? You can just see it all over the place, and you wonder why the management can't see it. Some people are really good at that. They have a talent and a gift for seeing those kinds of things. Nehemiah was one of those people. And so we can learn a lot about that from Nehemiah. Nehemiah opens up as a guy who is far away from Jerusalem. And so at Jerusalem, the people have gone back to Jerusalem, and they have built the temple in Jerusalem again. But Nehemiah is not there. He is basically across 2 deserts almost. He's well on the way to India, and he's in Shushan, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. And so you think about Babylon, they destroyed Jerusalem. And then the Medes, and followed by the Persians, they destroyed the Babylonians, and that's where Nehemiah is, when the people have gone back, rebuilt the temple. But Nehemiah finds out that while they have done that, there are still big issues that need to be solved in Jerusalem. And so even though he is miles and miles, 2 deserts away from where they are, he is very concerned about it. It says in Nehemiah chapter 1 that when he heard about the fact that they had no walls built around Jerusalem, he cried and he wept and he fasted. And that's the fasted for 4 months part. He fasted and he prayed about this because it was so important to him. You'd think if anybody would say that there was nothing that they could do about a situation, it would be Nehemiah. He wasn't in Jerusalem, and he wasn't really even anybody special in particular. He was the king's cupbearer. A cupbearer didn't have a say with the king most of the time. A cupbearer wasn't allowed to bring up things with the king. A cupbearer was just the guy who managed some staff and who tasted the food to make sure the king didn't die of poison, and then gave the food to the king. He wasn't really all that important in the kingdom. And you could see why Nehemiah, when he hears about Jerusalem and the problems there, he could say, I see the problems, but I'm so far away. What on earth could I, a cupbearer, do about the problems there? That's got to be someone else who's going to solve that problem. But it's not the kind of person Nehemiah is, right? That's not how he's going to handle it. And so he fasts for 4 months. And he prays for 4 months. And he plans for 4 months on how to solve this problem. And I think there's some really interesting things that we see from how he spends that 4-month period. And you might look at Nehemiah chapter 1 and you might ask yourself where the 4 months come from. Because at the beginning, he finds out about Jerusalem. And then if you look at the last verse of Nehemiah 1, it talks about how he says, let your servant prosper this day. And so it kind of sounds like he found about it in the morning, and then he went to the king that afternoon and tried to solve it. But it actually does give us a timeline here. If you'll notice in verse 1, it talks about the month of Chislev, which is a month in the middle of summer. And then in chapter 2 in verse 1, it's going to talk about the month of Nisan, which is toward the end of September. And so there is this 4-month period here where it says that he is praying and he is planning and he is fasting. And I think that doesn't mean he literally didn't eat for 4 months. That was, it's the idea, really the idea is this. When he had his lunch break, he kept doing his job. But when he had his lunch break, he didn't eat his lunch break. He planned and he prayed during his lunch break. When he had opportunities to take the time to prepare food and eat, he would eat crackers and then plan and pray. That's kind of the idea that he fasted for that 4-month period, is all the spare time that he could find, he spent it thinking about this problem and praying about this problem and trying to solve this problem so that he would be able to be a helper in the situation. And he does that. And you can tell that he's thought a lot about this. In chapter 2, when he comes before the king, he shows he's thought a lot about this. Down around verse 7 or so, he begins to ask the king for specific things. He's asking the king, he says, I need letters so that when the countries around us come to trouble us as we're trying to build the walls, I can say, no, the king says that I can do this. Right? He's thought through those problems that he's going to face. He says, I need letters that I can go to the guy who's in charge of the forest, and he will give me your wood. He'll give me some timber to go and build the walls. He's thought about the supplies that he needs, the problems that he's going to face, the workforce that he needs. He's thought through all of these issues over this 4-month period while still doing all of his job for the king that he was supposed to do. But more than that, I think it's really interesting when you look that Nehemiah wasn't just thinking about the problem and the solution. Nehemiah also spent clearly a lot of time thinking about how to communicate the solution. And I think, this is sort of like where a lot of people kind of struggle with, right? You have a great idea, but no one wants to do your idea. And oftentimes it's because of how you've delivered that idea. And Nehemiah knew that problem, and he really worked to solve that problem by spending a lot of time thinking about it and praying about it and fasting over it. And you see that at the beginning of chapter 2, when he comes before the king. And remember there in the beginning of chapter 2 when it says that he had a sad face? He looked sad in front of the king, and he had never looked sad in front of the king before. And the king asked him, what's going on? What's eating you today, Nehemiah? And so I think we could look at that and we could maybe think that he's just so overwhelmed with his emotions that he can't help but look that way. But remember, he has been doing this for 4 months. He's been serving the king for 4 months. And the king, he says, has never seen him look sad before. And so I think when you're looking at a sad face, you're looking at something very intentional. He purposefully strikes a sad face. He purposely changes the way his face looks because he wants the king to ask him, what's wrong, Nehemiah? If you're going to go before a king, you don't just walk in and say, hey, I've been thinking about something, right? That's not how it works. This is the same empire that Esther lived in. Esther, she's the queen. She can't just walk in the king's chambers and say, hey, I've been thinking about something. She was terrified for her life. Nehemiah is way down the food chain from Esther. He's way down where she was. Esther was going before the king. Nehemiah is going before his son, the next king. And so he goes in there, and he's thinking, if I handle this wrong, then I might lose my job. Or if I handle this wrong, I might lose my life. And so that's why you see he purposely makes this sort of sad countenance. He makes this sad face. But then what I think is really interesting at the end of verse 2 is he says that the king asked him. It works. It's exactly what he wants. It works exactly how he hopes he does. And then it says, I became dreadfully afraid. Have you ever had that happen? It works exactly how you want it, but it's terrifying at the same time. You're asking somebody out, and they say yes, but then you're just terrified, right? Or something like that. That's what happens here. It works, but it's still a terrifying situation. And I think that might be for 2 reasons. First, it's because the cupbearer, as we said, doesn't get to have a say. In fact, if you look at the Persian Empire, you look at their pottery or their paintings, oftentimes they'll paint these throne room pictures. And so you've got the king sitting on his throne, and then you have the cupbearer. You have the servants, and they're there, but their hands are in front of their mouth. It's always, they're like this, with their hands in front of their mouths. And they're painted that way because the idea is there's no room for you to speak. There's no room for you to have feelings. There's no room for you. Your one purpose is to serve the Persian king. That's sort of the idea. And so, he's terrified because he's broken the rule, and he's not certain that it's going to work out well for him. But there might even be another reason why, and that's because the king, his father, Xerxes, was assassinated by a servant in his bedchambers. And so, imagine if you're a king, and right? It's just part of the work of being a king people are going to try to kill you. That's just the job description. I don't know who wants to sign up for that, but that's the job description. People are going to try to kill you. And then your dad was murdered by one of his servants, and then your servant walks in, and he's looking all weird on his face, and he's got this strange look, and you're thinking, the last time one of the servants looked weird, my dad died. What's going on here? And I think you see that because in verse 2, he says he's dreadfully afraid, and so he yells out. He says to the king, "May the king live forever," right? I have no harm against you. Yes, I'm sad, and I would like to talk to you about that, but I don't mean anything bad against you, I want to live forever. And so you kind of get this tension that Nehemiah is going through here. But it's because it works, because he's planned it out. Not just the plan, he's planned the communication out. He's planned exactly how to get the king's attention in a difficult situation. He's planned exactly what to say to the king to ensure the best possible chance of success. He's planned all of the details he needs to ask the king for, because, you only get that opportunity once, right? You're not going to get another chance to ask him for any more things that you need. He has planned all of it out, down to the detail, including how to ask for it. And it works. And then you see him go to Jerusalem, and again, he does the same thing. This is sort of Nehemiah's thing. He goes to Jerusalem, and it says, in chapter 2, a little bit further down, it says he didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Notice, starting in verse 11, he didn't tell anyone what he was doing. For 3 days he was in Jerusalem, and he didn't say a word. Here's this guy coming. He would have been dressed nice. He would have had a big entourage with him. He would have been bringing all this lumber, all these things. People knew he was there for a reason. He clearly wasn't just there to stay at the Motel 6 for a couple of nights and move on, He had a purpose for being there, and he didn't say a word to anyone because he wasn't ready. He wanted to think things through. He wanted to make a plan of how to best communicate about it. It says he went out at night, and he walked all the way around the wall, kind of getting the lay of the land, figuring out where all the problems are, what needs to be done, and then, only then, after he's kind of seen it all for himself and really thought about it, prayed about it, fasted if that's what's necessary, he goes to the people and he gives them the information that they need. He presents it to them in a way that's going to be motivating to them. And he has some pushback, some people who don't want to do it, and he's ready for that. He's thought that through. He knows what to do with the naysayers. And then chapter 3, all this unity. Almost all of the people came together, and they worked to build different sections of the wall. They got the work done quickly. Can you imagine building a wall around a city in just 50 days? I think it was 50 days. That's pretty quick around a big place like Jerusalem, especially without the modern technology that we have today. They did it all quickly. They did it all well, not because they were particularly gifted at wall building. It says in chapter 3, some of them were like artisans and things like that. Some of them, they were like shoe repairmen, and they weren't wall builders, but they were motivated because Nehemiah had spent the time. He had prayed to God about it over and over. He had thought about it over and over. He had planned it all out. He thought about the people and what it would take to motivate them, and he put it into action, and it worked. But the biggest part is it worked because in that process, he lined himself up perfectly with how God thought about it, and it says God blessed him. In his chapter 2 and verse 8, he says at the end of chapter 2 and verse 8, it's according to the good hand of my God upon me. God blessed this. God allowed it to work. Chapter 2 and verse 20, he's talking to his enemies, the people who don't want him to, and he says, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. He knows God is going to help him do this because he's doing it the right way. He's dealing with it the right way. And so he is this great example of someone who is able to unify people. And he unifies them around God, not around himself. They're not unified around Nehemiah. They are unified around God. But he does that by first unifying them around God's work. And that really is, when you look throughout the Bible, the most important thing that any church can be unified around is the work that we are doing. When we are unified around the work, we become unified around God himself. And sometimes we try to unify ourselves around things that are important, but not quite as high up on that list. Sometimes we try to unify ourselves around social activities, and those are important, don't get me wrong. They are a vital part of a church, any church growth, any church fellowship, anything that we do. There needs to be those social activities. We need to have that time together. We need to know each other better and eat together and spend time with one another. That is a vital and important part of it. But no church will ever be as successful if they're unified around social activities as they are if they are unified around the work that we are doing. Nehemiah didn't come back and have a potluck. He came back and built them around the wall, the work that God needed done in his kingdom. And the thing is, most of you are probably actually really good at this, and you just didn't know it. Right? Have you ever wanted a day off from work, but you weren't really sure if your boss was going to give it to you? And so what do? You go in his office, and you're wearing a really nice tie today. I like that tie, And that email you wrote last week, man, it just blew me away. What an email. How are your kids doing? By the way, my cousin is getting married this Friday, and I was wondering, right? People are really good at this when they want something, right? Happy Father's Day, right? Almost all the dads in the room probably have stories about times when their kids wanted something, right? And it's like, Dad, I poured this lemonade for you, and you're so strong and brave, and I'm just so glad that you're my dad. And by the way, I was thinking that on Friday night, it's like you've got people know how to do this. It's a natural skill that we have even as little children. The difference is oftentimes we use it for things we want. Nehemiah used it for God's kingdom. Nehemiah used it for the work that God cares about, for the work that God wanted done. All those same principles in a way that is pleasing to God. And so you have these skills. It's just a matter of taking them and running them through the Nehemiah model, the way that Nehemiah does it, the pattern that Nehemiah gives us in chapters 1 through 3 for the work that God wants done. And so when you think about that, here are just a few ideas, a few principles from Nehemiah chapters 1 through 3 that can help us as we try to grow and to look and see what are the things, the ideas that we have, and the action that needs to be taken, and how can we do them to the best possible way. And so the first thing is that we are looking for a legitimate need, something that really does need to be done. Sometimes people have ideas, but they're not things that God would care about necessarily, just as far as like this is high on our priority list, right? They have ideas, but it's more like this is what I wish things were like, or this would make me happier, but it's not really important as far as like growing the church and unifying the church. And so we want to ask ourselves, is the thing that I'm working on something that really is legitimate in God's kingdom? That's something that's going to help the church to grow or to meet a need, or something that we could be doing but that we haven't started doing yet, or something that we used to do but for whatever reason, every church is going through this with COVID, things we used to do but for whatever reason we've gotten away from it, and we're looking for those kind of legitimate needs that you see the issue, you see the need there. Not everyone's good at seeing needs. Some people have a real knack for seeing needs. Some of you are really good at seeing needs. And you've been seeing needs for years maybe, or you see something new that you hadn't noticed before, but you either haven't been able to convince anyone to care about it, or you just don't know how to try to mention it. You don't know how to bring it up. And so Nehemiah shows us that if you have a real legitimate need, there is a path forward that God will bless to help to succeed in the work that we're doing. But the second thing we see is this idea of making it a priority. And so, that's Nehemiah is just a really great example of this, right? He's the guy that's 2 deserts away, and he makes it this huge priority for 4 months. In fact, it's such a big priority that he moves all the way across to Jerusalem to see it through, and he's there for years, making sure that it all comes together. And then he goes home and he comes back to check on it later, and he really made this a priority. And I think this is an important step that sometimes we skip when we see needs in our congregation, and that is we see the need. We maybe even have ideas on what to do about the need, but surely that's somebody else's priority, right? Surely someone else is going to take care of this. Surely someone else is going to do this. I might mention it, but I don't really want to be the one to do it. And Nehemiah shows us that if it's not a priority to you, you are not going to be able to convince anyone else that it is a priority. And really, if it is a need in God's kingdom, then what greater priority is there? What thing deserves our time and our focus more than the needs that we have to grow and to strengthen and to better our congregation? That's the greatest need. That's the highest priority. But we have to make that commitment personally. I see this need. I'm going to make it a priority in my life. It doesn't mean that you're doing it all by yourself. Nehemiah didn't build the whole wall by himself. It doesn't mean that you're even going to be the leader of it, right? But at least make it enough of a priority that you're going to put in the time to pray a lot about it. And that's kind of the next thing we see, is that one of the reasons sometimes why the needs that we see, that we can't figure out how to fill them, it's because we haven't spent enough time praying about them. We haven't spent enough time talking to God about those needs. He knows all of our needs, but James still says he wants you to ask him about them. He knows all of the solutions to our needs, but sometimes we miss them because we're just thinking about it here. We're just thinking about it amongst each other, and we've forgotten to ask the one who knows everything what he thinks about this and how he would want us to deal with this. And so Nehemiah spends a lot of time in prayer thinking about needs, this particular need, and how to deal with it. But you know what prayer really does? What prayer really does is that it helps you to see it from God's perspective. This is another thing that we do naturally. You know, if I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about what I'm saying, but I'm also kind of trying to gauge, are you understanding it? Am I coming across the way that I want to? And are you receiving it? And if you're not receiving it, what's the reason? Is there a hang-up? Is it my communication style? Do we have different beliefs and I didn't realize it? You know, I'm thinking about things from your perspective, even as I'm saying them, because I want to make sure that my words are not just hitting a wall, that we're on the same page about things. Well, the same thing happens when you talk to God. When you talk to God, you remember you are talking to a person. You are talking to your Father. And so it just happens naturally. You tend to think about those things more from his perspective. You think about how he's receiving it, and then you think about what maybe he thinks about it, and then you turn to the Bible, and you kind of study about situations similar to your situation, people who went through things similar to what you're going through, and how did God handle those? What did God say about those? And the more that you pray about it, the more that you're going to think about it from how God thinks about it, and the more you're going to see it how he sees it. The more that you pray about it, the more you're going to also find the solution the way that he sees the solution. And it comes not because as you pray he's putting words in your head or something, but because you just naturally do that. When you communicate with someone, you think about how they are receiving what you are saying. That's what we do with God when we pray. And so the more that Nehemiah prayed, the better able he was to see things from God's perspective and to find a solution that's going to work best. And so you can't spend too much time praying about any need that you see. And so at the least, make it that priority every day for this need, big or small, that I see in the church. If it's a legitimate need, I'm going to carve out some time, 5 minutes, an hour, whatever I can, whatever I think it takes, to pray about that need and to think about that need so that I can see it from God's perspective and I can seek his help, which of course is the other part of prayer, is that, you know, God really does hear and want to hear and listen to our prayers. He really does take action based on what we pray. And so while you're praying about it, perhaps he's doing things over here that you don't even know about through providence to help all of it come together in the right way. Nehemiah knew that. He trusted in that. And so make it a priority. Spend time praying about it before you've said anything to anyone. But then also make a plan. Spend enough time thinking about it that you might have some ideas about how to solve the problem. You might have some suggestions about how to move forward. You've spent enough time thinking about the obstacles that when people say, well, what about this? You at least have some idea about how to answer that. That's where ideas get killed the most, right? The obstacle phase. You've got a great idea, but there's always Debbie Downer, right? She's always there. There's always, that person who says, well, what about this? And the truth is, we need those people. We need the people who see the obstacles, because if you can't see the obstacles, you're going to get started and you're going to smack into it, and then it's over like that because you weren't prepared for it. We need those people, but we also need the people who can see the obstacles and figure out how to get past them. And so, think about those obstacles beforehand. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have the whole plan. I'm not saying you have to have it all figured out. I'm not saying you have to thought of every possible obstacle and you have to have it all mapped out in this crazy-looking chart on a whiteboard somewhere, But spend enough time thinking about it that when people ask you questions, well, that's interesting. I haven't really thought about doing that before. What about this? Or how would we handle that? You can show that you spend at least enough time to be taken seriously, which I think is what most people really want. They just want to know that they can take you seriously. You've really thought about this, and it's not just some harebrained thing that you've dreamed up in the last 5 minutes. And so pray about it, but then think about it. Make a plan. Nehemiah spent 4 months, and you don't have to fast the whole 4 months, right? You don't have to do it that way, but spend some time thinking about it. And certainly do make sacrifices to think about it if that's what it takes. If it takes occasionally missing a lunch so that you have time to think about it because your life is so busy, sure. Why not miss a lunch here and there? Some of us could probably use to miss a lunch here or there, right? And so, why not miss a lunch here or there so that you have that time and you're not missing time with your kids or your wife or your husband, and you're not shirking on your work duties. You're just finding little places to make those small sacrifices like Nehemiah did so that you have the time because you've made it a priority. Because the work of the church is worth making it a priority. Because the needs that we have are worth spending time on in prayer and in planning. But then more than that, plan how to best communicate about it. And I think this is a final step that Nehemiah did so well on. He's such a good example on. You can have all the details right, but if you don't know how to say it, nobody's going to listen, and nobody's going to care, and nobody's going to follow you down that road. Think about who needs to know about it. Do you need to talk to the elders about it? Is it one of the deacons? It's their specialty area. You need to talk to him about it. Is it something that the ladies are working on together that you need to talk to some of who is it that needs to hear about this? Who are the people who can really make a difference in getting this off the ground and moving it forward? Think about those people. Nehemiah thought about the king. What is it going to take to get the king to listen to me? He thought about who he was. He thought about his position in relationship to the problem in Nehemiah. He thought about what kind of person he was. If you notice, in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1, it says that it was when the wine was before him. That's kind of the idea. They were having some kind of celebration or feast. He was in a really good mood. Right? Nehemiah picked a time when the king would be in a really good mood to ask him a question. And that's, I think that makes sense, right? I remember when I worked in newspapers, I had a salesman one time, and he went to a customer, someone who wasn't a customer yet, that he wanted to be a customer. And he was like, I was really wondering if you'd be interested in placing an advertisement in our newspaper. And the guy said, absolutely not. And he was really upset. And so my salesman, every now and then he'd have a good idea. And he looked at him that day and he said, if I came back on a different day, would that make a difference? And the guy kind of stopped and he thought and he said, I'm having a really bad day. It probably would. And he did. He went back like a week later and he made the sale, And so sometimes that's all it is people are just in a bad mood, right? They're just, if you know that someone is going to be they're always really preoccupied before worship. They're always thinking about their Bible class and they're coming in a little bit late and they're flustered. That's not the time to stop them and say, I've been thinking about this. They can't listen to you then. They can't focus. They can't, that's not the time to talk to that person. Maybe you need to ask them if you can have lunch with them one day or call them Sunday afternoon. Are they a phone person or an in-person person, right? People are different. Some people really respond better over the phone. Some people you need to be face-to-face to talk about things. Are they, do they work all week? Or are they mostly home all week and they'd be fine with you popping in on a Tuesday afternoon? What kind of person or the different people are they? When's the best time to talk about them? When is the best place to talk about it? What's the best scenario? Not because you're trying to get things pushed that you want. It's because you see the work that needs to be done and you have an idea that you think will help. You have a thought that you think will make the church more successful for God's glory, to grow God's kingdom. And if we'll do it for ad sales and things like that, if we'll do it to be able to borrow Dad's car on Friday night, why would we not do it? Why would we not put that kind of thought and energy and effort into growing God's kingdom? That's what Nehemiah did. He thought about the king, and he made a plan, and he communicated it well, and it worked. And so you have that idea. And that kind of leads us naturally to this thought. Don't talk about it until you're ready. Don't bring people in until you've thought about it and prayed about it for quite some time. I think we tend to have an idea and we just want to get it out. We just want to share it with somebody. This is really cool. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened. I've had this thought, oh man, it's brilliant, y'all. I mean, it's just going to be so awesome, and I can't wait to start it. And I'm just talking 100 miles an hour to Sarah, and then I get done with all of it, and she's really good about just letting me talk until I finally run out of breath. And then she'll just very calmly say, well, what about this? I've never even thought of that before, And my whole plan is destroyed in just 1 second. And it's because I didn't spend enough time thinking about it. But you know what else it does? Because I'm still really, really, really excited about it, I'm just like super defensive at that point. It's like, I don't want to hear that. Don't rain on my parade. But she's absolutely right. She sees something that I should have seen, and I would have seen if I had thought about it just a little bit longer, if I had prayed about it just a little bit more. And so that's a key thing that Nehemiah does. You see it in Nehemiah chapter 2. He says it over and over again. He says in verse 12, he says, I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do. There was no animal with me. He didn't even want the animals listening, right? He says, there's no one with us except the one that I rode. And he goes and he goes on, and he says in verse 16, he says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, even the leaders of the town. He says, I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. He didn't want to say something before he knew how to say it. He didn't want to say something before he had thought through all the things that he needed to think through. He didn't want to say something until he thought about the people who he was going to say it to. And he didn't want to say something that was going to give his enemies time to cause problems before he had really gotten everything launched. And so he was very careful. I think there's great wisdom in that. The Proverbs will talk about that. There's a time to be silent. There's a time to hold your tongue. There's a time to really just dwell and think and process. That's what Nehemiah was doing. Any good idea is worth that time. Any idea that's really worth pursuing is worth that kind of forethought before you tell anyone about it. And then, if you have done all of that, and I know it sounds like a lot, I know that it maybe sounds a little bit overwhelming, but if you have done those things, you can trust God's success, that God will be on your side to work things out in whatever way is best. Nehemiah trusted that. We looked at 2:8, where he said, it was according to the good hand of my God upon me. He knew God was helping him succeed in this because he had spent the time to know, what does God's word say about these things? What does God expect about this? How would God handle this? If he were here today as a human form with us, if he had known about Jesus, he would have asked that question, how would Jesus have handled this as our example of God as a human? He had thought all through of that. And so he knew that he had done everything he could to closely as possible line up with God, and he knew that God would bless him. And so then you're ready to communicate, and you're ready to take action, and you're ready to watch God work great things based on some of the things that you have done, based on the example of Nehemiah. And anytime that you have an idea, there almost always are going to be people who don't like it. Well, maybe God loves it, but there's going to be people who don't like it. That's almost always going to happen. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't peacefully pursue it and peacefully persist that it is a good idea, as long as, I guess if everybody is against it, maybe, that's some idea. But it's like if it's one or two people who are just kind of naysaying, you're always going to have those people who say, we've never done it that way before. That you're always going to have those people. And I sympathize with those people. I think change is terrifying. Change is kind of a scary thing. That's what they mean when they say that. We've never done it that way before. They're saying, I've never seen it happen. I don't really see how it could work because I don't understand it. It change is kind of scary. And so we sympathize with those people, but we want to work with them slowly and patiently and lovingly to get them to a point where they can see it. And we certainly don't want to sabotage an entire project that is going to help the Lord's people grow, that's going to help us reach out to other people. We don't want to do those things just because one person says, we've never done it that way before. Or, you're always going to have those people who say things like this, we've tried to fix it before, and it just can't be fixed. There's always someone who says something like that. And they're sincere people. They're trying to help you. What they mean is, I want to fix that too, and I've tried to fix it, and it's not going to work. The people are against it, or here's my laundry list of reasons why it's not going to work. But what we want to do with those people is we want to slowly and gently and lovingly help them see what is kind of a hard truth to see. Just because your plan didn't work doesn't mean it can't be fixed, doesn't mean we can't meet this need in some way. And that's a hard thing to accept, but it doesn't mean that the idea won't work just because someone says that. And you see that at the end of Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 19. There are all the enemies around him, talking about how he must be rebelling against the king, how he must be, he's got to be this bad guy. He's trying to put all this doubt into people's minds. He's trying to end the project before it's even started. And in chapter 2 and verse 20, Nehemiah answered them and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we his servants, I love that, whoever is really a servant of God, whoever really wants to be on God's side, we his servants will arise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. Now, to be clear, he's talking to people who are not Jews. I'm not saying that if someone says something bad about your project, you should tell them they have no heritage or right or memorial in, the Grace and Church of Christ or heaven or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. But that's the idea, is he was ready for those, and he was able to keep moving forward despite those, because he had put the time in. He had put the sacrifice in. He had put the prayer and whatever else it took in, so that when he presented it, most of the people were ready to go, and they did. They built the wall. That was a big project, but he was able to do it. God blessed him to do it because of those principles that we have talked about there. And so anytime I think about Nehemiah, I can't help but think about the beehive. Bees are a unified little group of animals, right? There's almost no group of animals that I can think of that are more unified than bees. Everything centers around the queen bee. The drones, the male bees, there's not many of them, but they have one job, and that is to help her make the next generation of bees. The nanny bees, right? They fly around in there, and all their job